Okay, well, with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? We have a packed 1 hour to spend together today, and we're really excited about having a robust discussion. I see many of you are introducing yourselves in the chat, saying your name, where you're from, who you're with, and anything else you'd like to say. Feel free to continue to use the chat throughout the next hour with your questions, your comments, your observations, and in some cases, even your accusations. Feel free to use that in a very robust way. Once again, my name is Anthony Ogden. I'd like to welcome you all here today. I am with Gateway International Group, a relatively new organization you may have heard or seen in various venues, focusing on next generation international education. Now, today we're focusing specifically on next generation education abroad. Let me just say at the very outset here, if you are, well, first of all, thank you all very much again for joining us. But if you've, and as well, thank you very much to those of you who've taken the survey that we're actually going to speak to today. Thank you very much. Now, if you've not had a chance to download your free copy of the report, I encourage you to do that right away so you can follow along as we go through a brief overview of the report today. You can do that on the Gateway website, and that address is gatewayinternational.org. Just scroll over to Gateway Resources and you'll see right there the report and how to get your free copy. So if you've not done that, feel free to join the hundreds of others that have done so. Download your copy and you'll be able to look at it straight away. Let me also introduce my colleagues here today. We have a number of colleagues from Gateway International Group, and including myself, as well as Angie Johnson, who's coming to us live today from Greece, and then joining us from our colleagues at Podium Education. Now, if you're not familiar with Podium Education, you really need to be. They are a true trailblazer and innovative organization looking at global tech programming. You'll hear more about Podium in just a moment. But joining us from Podium Education is Chris Parrish, the president of Podium Education. He's just waved. Hey there, Chris. And Caroline Ikes and Aled Owens, who are the brains behind the survey that you'll hear more about today. Now, let me go ahead and just transfer and going over the agenda today. Now, you see, we have just a very simple agenda, but indeed, this is a very packed discussion hour together. What we're going to do for maybe the first 10 to 15 minutes or so is just sort of introduce to you the report, its origins, as well as some of the key findings that have emerged. Now, if you've downloaded your own copy of the report, you can look at it more closely later and pick up some of the more nuances that we won't have time to cover today. But then more importantly, and especially important today for this webinar, is not to focus so much on the report itself, but really to focus on some of the key findings and the recommendations that have stemmed from the data that we've gathered. And joining us today are a couple of colleagues who both responded to the survey and who have actually commented already on some of the findings. And I'll introduce our colleagues in a short while. But then after that, we'll, as time allows, we'll talk a little bit about some of the key recommendations that might inform your actions wherever you are in the world. And there will be time as well for Q&A, both about the methodology, about any of the findings. Now, with that, let me just say and reinforce a comment that I think is really important for all of us to hear. There's been a lot of change in the world, and there certainly have been numerous changes with regard to all of our collective and shared work in international higher education. Specific to that is education abroad. But one thing that certainly hasn't changed, and that is our goal. Our goal is very much the same. Our goal is still very much to graduate students who understand the international nuances of their chosen discipline and who are able to work internationally, interculturally in very effective ways in this more globally interconnected world. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Chris Parrish of Podium Education to really give us a bit more of a grounding in the report and its origins. Chris?
Sure, thanks, Tony. It goes without saying that the last 18 months have been transformational for a lot of different sectors of higher education. And I think in a lot of ways, maybe most interestingly, zeroing in on international education and global education offices. And we had seen a number of really great resources out there, great benchmarking reports out there for more traditional mobility-based programming, where there are plenty of organizations out there that do sort of a pulse check on mobility-based programming and where trends are headed. And at Podium, we've always been focused on exclusively online global learning and thinking about where higher education and education abroad offices in particular, as they look at their portfolio of offerings and start to consider some of these more emerging trends in virtual digital online programming, how to best do that, and how to perhaps learn from their peers to supercharge the ability to offer new and innovative ways to deliver global education to their students. So the context of this report is we really wanted to sort of zero in on online global education and how at abroad offices are responding to not just the COVID trend, but also more deeply how they think about these online offerings as a part of their portfolio here in the short term, and then also moving forward. And this report was really constructed as a resource. We wanted to try and ask the questions that we were hearing most often from our partners. I wish I knew how many other schools are doing X or how many other schools are doing Y. And that was the impetus behind designing this Next Generation Education Abroad report. So as we go through this, one thing I would love to know is if there are questions that we missed through this, or there are concepts that you wish we had touched on, drop them in a chat or email them to us afterwards. We do this report as a service to the industry. And I want to make sure that it is as relevant, powerful, useful to you all as possible. So hopefully we got a couple big items. We shine some light on a couple big trends and items, which Caroline and Alan will go through here momentarily. But if there are other things that you wish you knew what others in the industry are doing or how they're handling certain things, we'd love to hear it. We're all ears. So please chat that in.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And so with that in mind, I think where we'd like to start is perhaps to give a bit more background to the survey and how we administered the survey and what fed into the report. So with this being our first survey of this kind, it was really important for us to capture enough responses to be able to pull credible, useful trends and conclusions. So we spent a lot of time thinking about survey structure and setting minimum completion requirements for respondents. We didn't want this to be something that folks could necessarily answer in 30 seconds. We wanted them to be able to have to sit down and really think about it, but also at the same time recognizing that we didn't want to ask too much of their time. And so a survey for us between that kind of 10 to 12 minute completion time was really the sweet spot. The first time, when we think about it, the first time we produce a report like this, it can be difficult to pull responses because respondents aren't always fully aware of how data is going to be used. Maybe they're not that familiar with Podium, what these responses are going to contribute towards. And so again, for us, it was really important that we were clear that we weren't using individual responses in any of our feedback or published material. Instead, it was the collated response, being able to compare across wider ranges of institutions, from publics to privates, for example, or from institutions that send a lot of students to study abroad to those institutions that send fewer. So just the background there, we received 90 respondents to the survey, which included individuals from universities and colleges as well as providers. We had 67 university professionals respond from 57 universities, and that included obviously public to private, varying sizes, coast to coast. And so for us, that was really important to be able to pull a more diverse and in-depth findings across those different subsets of institutions. So, with all that in mind, we welcome questions about how we put this survey together. But with all that in mind, ahead of the panel discussion, we'd love to kind of quickly hit our key findings, if that's okay. Caroline?
Right. So one of the first key findings is that it is a new day for education abroad. For instance, while online global programming existed pre-COVID, largely in the COIL format, the rapid adoption of online global learning revealed new opportunities to expand global education on campus. And this has led to 75% to say that a new definition of education abroad is needed that is inclusive of other forms of programming beyond mobility-based programs. And 31% are considering changing the names of their office to better reflect the new suite of the programs that they'll be offering. Most are approaching this new era of education abroad with optimism. 62% state that they are excited about the changes underway and are looking forward to new opportunities ahead. For instance, 75% of the respondents think online global learning is essential and here to stay, with 67% adding online global learning programs to their portfolio and 46% adopting new funding models to support this programming. However, as the last few weeks with the Delta variant have shown, challenging times are still here with us in both programming and operational budgets. Heading into the new academic year, many education abroad offices are facing renewed budget cuts, restructures, and consolidation. Among our respondents, 75% said that their education abroad office budgets have been reduced. 46% offices have been restructured, and 40 of the offices have seen their operational funding models modified as a result of decreased mobility. And the changes continue to come. In the future, 45% anticipate a change to their funding model, 41% to their office structure, 49% to the purview of their office in general, and as I mentioned before, 31% are considering changing the name of their offices. And there is an increased focus on DEI. Addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a focus of education abroad professionals for many years. We know that. But the events of the last year have reinvigorated this focus within many offices. Among our respondents, 65% of education abroad offices have made DEI a greater focus of their work, and 45% anticipate online global learning to be central to their DEI efforts. But this is not as a replacement for mobility-based programming, but an additional modality to offer global education to all students, regardless of their ability to study abroad.
Yeah, and for us, we also concluded that student choice may be changing, and the things that factor into student choice are changing. So, for us, the three things that stood out, program cost, subject, and academic credit, were really the key factors that students that we believe are factoring into students' decisions. And it wasn't even close. Those were the three that stood out above everything else. So the question becomes, how can we create scalable, cost-accessible programs for students in subjects that we know contribute either to their degree or to their career readiness? And then in another part of the report, we talk about how 65% of education abroad offices reported that they're able to award academic credit, which is great, but it leaves the other 45% having to ensure they're building those strong academic partnerships across campus, particularly to solidify that credit partner to work on new or experimental programs. One thing I'd love to bring your attention to at the bottom of this page is this idea of Zoom fatigue, because one of the most interesting things to come out of the report is the number of respondents who believe that Zoom fatigue is playing a factor. I didn't personally challenge many of the results within this report, but this is the one thing that I have thought a lot more about. And because while I believe that we in the workforce, many of us have Zoom fatigue, students are telling us differently. In fact, on the academic side, in the past 2 months, there've been a number of reports out that suggest that the majority of students prefer either hybrid or online learning over an all in-person classroom experience. So that's one of the stats within the report that I think needs a little bit more digging, and perhaps to survey of a few thousand students to see if that matches up. Does their impression match ours? And then institution size and type. So one of the things that was clear within the report was that large public institutions, particularly those that traditionally send more students abroad by volume and percentage, generally reported more excitement and confidence about the future. We think that's really interesting. We attribute that to generally more stability within larger offices, particularly compared to very small, even one-person offices. I also think it's been easier to pilot new or experimental programs in larger offices over the past 18 months, whether that's online virtual programs or anything else that help to drive new revenue in a time that's of uncertainty. And then the one stat they also want to highlight is that DEI is of greater importance to our colleagues in private institutions. There's a number of reasons why that could be, we think. One, potentially necessity, having to find new student groups who want to have an international education experience or new areas of focus. It also could be attributed to the fact that private university institutions are a little bit behind our public counterparts in terms of cross-campus engagement. But that's another thing we'd like to really kind of dig a little bit deeper into as we iterate this survey and this report.
Great. Well, thank you, Caroline and Aled, very much for that summary. Now, that was a very quick summary, folks. And just to underscore the fact, when anybody does a survey, it really is a snapshot of a sample of a population. So it will be fascinating, I think, if I were on the other side of this webinar today, to be thinking how these findings relate to my own context. So we're not necessarily arguing here generalization, but I think it is very interesting to see that the findings from this survey actually do echo some of the findings from the various and the most recent surveys from the Forum on Education Abroad about some of the trends and developments that they have seen in these other surveys that have been conducted. I encourage you to look at the state of the field surveys from the forum. But the truth is, change again is underway. There's a lot happening, and now we're at this juncture to be considering, what do these findings, whether it's the forum's findings or these findings, how does it all position now in the decisions and the trajectory that we see ahead? Now, I am very optimistic about the changes, but I imagine many of you are as well, but we have a lot of questions still. And so we've invited two very special colleagues of mine who are also noted in the report. We have Dr. Kyle Anderson, Senior Director of Global Education at Clemson. Hello, Kyle. You have to wave at me, Kyle. And thank you very much. And then we also have Dr. Utio Rachowdhury from he's the Vice Provost for Internationalization at the University of Denver. And we realized a connection because previously Utio was at Clemson. So this is a bit of a Clemson fest here today. But boys, please behave, and let's focus on some of the questions that we have for you. Now, as we go forward over the next 20 minutes or so, Chris and I are going to be asking some questions to Kyle and or Utio, but really the questions are for everyone here. And though we can't really see you, we would invite you to unmute yourself if you can and answer some of the questions that we're posing. We've intentionally proposed a few, what I'd like to think are provocative questions in the report, but we want to ask those questions now to really generate this robust discussion. So if you don't feel that you would like to unmute yourself and join the conversation, that's fine, but do add your thoughts and challenges and insights into the chat as you will, because this is an important juncture for all of us. And so let's use this time now to really be thinking about that juncture. Okay, Chris, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, I'll jump in. Perhaps I'll turn to Utio first, and then Kyle, if you have a response to this prompt as well, please jump in. I would love to hear your thoughts on which parts of this new modality or perhaps focus on online global education, which parts of this stick long term, which parts might be perhaps a little bit of a sugar high through COVID, and which parts do you think belong as part of the portfolio of an ed abroad office long term? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Chris. As I indicated in my quote, we cannot solely be revenue dependent, mobility reliant, to essentially fulfill the mission, the vision, the values of global engagement. And to each unit and office and university, I encourage that look at the work of your office and your goals and objectives, which will clearly articulate how we can fulfill those goals. And I hope that you would do it with a justice, equity, diversity, inclusion perspective, but also pay attention to the competencies that need to be in place to do that. So unless those goals are exclusively indicating that people need to have an in-person travel experience, how are those global learning objectives being fulfilled, and how can we best achieve and make a case for that within the units and leadership? We are about to enter a world of alternate digital realities where people will work, will play, will socialize. People are calling it the metaverse now, the mirror world, the AR cloud. You have all kinds of names, from spatial internet to others. But we need to learn from folks. I mean, the education industry has been pretty archaic in its operation in how it has conducted. But we can look to others. I mean, you look at IT, but say for example, the food industry. The sensory exploration towards the experiential goals cannot be tied. I mean, you can learn from a chef without visiting a restaurant, or in person. You could learn it over a video and be a cook yourself. So traditional study abroad has been very restrictive in providing those goals, but with short-term research focus, internship focus, there's so many options. We need to make sure that we are aligning with our curricular integration goals within the graduation pathways for people. We need to think about sustainable development goals and how the role of this the fourth industrial revolution is playing into this education industry, which clearly outlines the need for technology to come front and center. Knowledge construction and innovation cannot be mobility dependent. The future really is an incorporation of a mixed modality approach so that it can appeal and include all. And that is really key if we want to emphasize the broad appeal and the necessity for everyone to have this kind of experience and have those global competencies.
Uchiel, let me just pick at that answer for a second, if you don't mind. I agree with everything you've said. I think it's important that you've also mentioned Industry 4.0, and that has been a driver for a number of years. And the COVID pandemic has been more of an accelerator, right? But is this, I love Chris's phrase about a sugar high. Is this really a sugar high, or when mobility starts returning, are we just going to get back to the way things are? Or is this a permanent shift? Or is this shift looking likely to be permanent?
I hope it is. I hope it is a shift for the better for all kinds of things, that from the place where we were, very dependent on only one kind of in-person experience to get on a plane, we can change and we can understand that globalization is happening around us. There's internationalization at home. There is, the technology-driven interface, and there are, all kinds of opportunities that are available for people to get that. So I hope we do not go back to the old terms. In fact, I think we will not. And people who are going to be reliant on that are selling themselves short and are going to be very in a fragile space.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Uchiel, you kind of kicked the door open for us here at Clemson, because we started a virtual reality and augmented realities and global learning lab, where we're leaning into what you're saying. But I think, Chris, what I would answer is, I don't think we're even close to done with coming up with a new virtual modalities. So I think this is going to be controversial, and everyone's going to write in the chat and be upset with me, because we're all feeling the pain of this. But what's probably slotted to happen this year is actually going to help us more with that development. I know that the big question, the subtext for all of this, is the financial model, and UTO is really going to help us think about that, and we're all struggling with that. And whether we go back or don't and pick a new future or don't will depend largely on that. But watching the faculty develop their own, watching what different universities, not just in the United States, but internationally, are doing, what we're doing together with our strategic partners to come up with new virtual models, I don't think we're done yet. I don't think we're at a place where we can say, these are the four: the global classroom, the IVE, the COIL, and these are going to stick and these aren't. I think we have to understand that we keep that open, and we're going to see a lot more as well. That's what I have to add.
Let's move to the next question. Is that okay, Chris?
Sure.
Well, I've noticed in the past several months a considerable restructuring happening within offices, but also consolidation of education abroad offices or other areas of international offices being consolidated with other offices around campus. And I got a call not so long ago from a call to Gateway from a person who was asking me. She said, well, Tony, you know, I really don't know much about this international education world. Can you help me? And I said, well, what office are you at? She said, well, I'm in career services, but now everything international has just been put under me. So I think this consolidation is actually more pervasive than we actually have evidence or knowledge of. And I'm wondering, at least I have seen over the last 30 years, a considerable professionalization of international education. People are getting advanced graduate degrees. They're coming in with considerable professionalization. We're develop standards, ethics, and so on. So we're seeing a great professionalization of education abroad. But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts if this restructuring and consolidation continues at the pace that I think is happening? Are we going to see a loss of the momentum of that professionalization that we've been enjoying for several decades now? What do you think, either of you or anybody here today?
So the key question, Tony, is the consolidation is for the purpose of surviving or thriving. And it depends on our outlook. And I think it depends on the university administration outlook and how well the education abroad, the international education community makes the case. We have suffered actually from remaining isolated in our spheres and not working collaboratively. And this is an opportunity for others across the education industry to really understand the importance of the work we do and how best we can do it together. The traditional barriers of cost, of curriculum, of culture can be bridged with a broader collaboration and understanding. So again, are we doing it only so that our revenues stay in place, or are we doing it because that is what makes best sense in the university or whatever sphere we are working for us to be able to thrive and succeed? Again, it goes back to the mission, vision, those goals, objectives. We need to align with that and make sure that we are fulfilling that, not looking at a pre-baked answer, but we derive the answer from what we want to do, how we build those competencies. And I think that's what is going to really drive us. It doesn't, most places have it within academic affairs, but there are places who also have it within student affairs. But we know that you need both. And so regardless of where you are, the collaboration is going to be key, and broader understanding across the university for faculty, for staff, for all of them to recognize the importance of this work.
Well, let me just ask there, Utio, there's been this question about centralized international offices and decentralized international offices. Are you saying that we will see, in fact, I'm not sure if this is a bad thing, that internationalization becomes so much more decentralized that actually the role of the international office as we've known it is going to shift because of that?
Well, I've worked in places with both kinds of operations. In fact, I enjoy having the decentralized mode, but certain centralized things. I mean, issues like, say, risk management, policies, they come in from the central space, but the adoption, the curricular integration pieces, they come in a decentralized manner because each discipline, each unit has its own needs and objectives on how best to fulfill them. So, it is a mix, but for each unit, it has to be seen for each university and academic space, what works best for them.
Yeah, going back to the original question, Tony, and then I'll jump in there too. Is that consolidation going to happen? I think it does go back to this issue of how is international education, how closely is it tied to the strategic mission of the institution already? And that will be, OTO talks about the office's ability to make the case. But if it's already built into your institutional strategic mission, or you have executive leadership teams who consider it a mission of the institution, one of the previous institution I worked for was, then it will morph into ways that will always be important. That I know is not the case at a lot of our institutions. We're doing a lot of marketing and a lot of fighting, but I do think that I see this at larger institutions where all the different services provided by an education abroad office, right, are still crucial, right, above and beyond study abroad. You start to discover and create new ways that you're serving the other missions of the institution that you have never done before. And I'll just give a quick example. One of the chasms that's existed institutionally in higher ed in the United States has been between, let's say, our DEI offices and our international education offices. We see each other, we know each other, we understand each other, but we don't often work together. But now, and this will probably come up in another question, but now there are real opportunities for some synergy between those offices to meet institutional goals to improve intercultural understanding communication. That's one area. Typically, I haven't seen a lot of our types of offices engaging with faculty at the nexus of the research and undergraduate space. It tends to be a lot of undergraduate space, but at a big institution, you might begin to find that all of a sudden, all of your international resources, strategic partnerships, global partnerships, et cetera, can now be offered as a resource to that research agenda, whatever that may be. At institutions, it's greater and smaller at others. So I do think there are ways that we can show our value outside of that traditional mobility. And so I think that professionalization of the field can still be relevant, but it just might manifest perhaps in other specialties more than just the logistics of travel. Now it's about matching, right? Matching international faculty, matching international research agendas. Global service learning that can be done virtually. It's that type of connection.
Great. And
Chris, before you jump to
Yeah,
the next
sure.
question, do you mind if I just point out a question in the Q&A presented by Octavio? I think it's an important question if everybody can see it. He's asking about quality, and he's also asking about disparity of access. And I think these are very important questions that we have been talking about for the last year. If I may just join the panel for one quick second and offer my thoughts on that question, and that is about quality and or disparity of access. The way I'm seeing what's happening is this shift in basically this continuum of international learning and engagement is expanding. And that now, before we focus so much and so heavily on mobility-based learning, now our toolkit, if you will, our toolbox has really now expanded to enabling us to pursue other modalities of learning. Now, what we don't want to do, to Octavio's point, is to say, okay, all of the rich white girls, you can study in Europe, and everybody else, you can take online learning. That's just a bit naive and silly thinking. But the truth is, what we really want to do is to create well-articulated programs for particular outcomes, and then allow students to select those programs. Because the truth is, a lot of international educators often think the goal or the key rationale or the driving rationale for education abroad is intercultural learning. And that is an important rationale, but it is not the only rationale. And so depending on what it is that a student wants to learn and to be able to achieve, they will then find a program irrespective of its modality and find it. So if we design programs with intentionality for the space in which they're going to be delivered, then we will have, I would like to think, consistent quality across all modalities, and access will be enhanced not because of a particular modality, but because of a continuum of modalities that actually have more to offer. I could go in more depth on that, but I know Chris has some thoughts and some other questions queued up.
Yeah, I was actually going to pick up on that one as well. And I think, there's a sliver to that question around like evaluating the quality of these online digital offerings. I wish I do not have a background in international education. My entire career has been spent in digital online learning and partnering with universities to build programs in it. And I've sort of embedded myself in doing it the right way with quality in mind. And I guess I would encourage you to ask tough questions of partners and vendors and providers that come to you. You'll, after seeing a couple different demos or pitches, I think you'll get a sense for who designed programming to be digital first from the ground up. And that makes a big difference versus somebody who maybe had something that was mobility based, that is trying to sort of build it backwards into virtual. Really good, high quality online course design typically will start knowing that it's going to be digital first. And that's sort of a question that I would recommend that you keep as part of your top 3 questions on your Rolodex as you're evaluating these different opportunities. Is, of course, it might look good on the screen, but knowing really the way that it was constructed, I think is quite an important factor that a lot of people forget about. I think there's also a couple questions around revenue and sort of structuring of programs in a way that is most beneficial. So Terrence Graham asks us a question. To what extent can study abroad budgeting be decoupled from revenue from international student enrollments? It's a really good question. I don't, Kyle or Utio, if you guys have a thought on that.
I think it should absolutely be. Again, the global learning is not dependent on international student enrollment coming in. Universities in their home pages all put in that we are this world-class global university. It is a time to go and ask your president and chancellor, how are you doing that? To ask the administration, it has to be more than a view book, statement. Are they, again, go back to really making the case if it has already not been made? It probably is, but they have been tied in with these revenue structures. And yes, it has helped the university, but I think education abroad is central to the idea of education. It is integral. It is not separate from that. So we need to really make the case that just like, any other thing, I mean, global competencies, global learning, the global knowledge development, skill development, attitude should be part of every course on campus eventually. And at some point in time, that will include maybe experiential components to that, where you may be, getting on a plane, but you could also be doing it while being on campus through technology. We need to bring in officers of teaching and learning to really learn the pedagogical shift that needs to happen to get that done. And these are many of these new things for how abroad officers are doing, Again, this is the difference between we are not travel agents, we are international education professionals. I hope we can make the case and that people don't think of us or continue to think of us like that.
I would add there's no better way of indicating from an institutional perspective the importance or the core nature of international education than to have it centrally funded. Right? I know at all our institutions, our offices are going to look, there's hybrid funded, where some comes from fees, some comes revenue, some is directly supported by the institution. But where I see institutions that are committed, it's part of their mission, it's part of how they sell their institution, their educational experience, it tends to be funded, right? As Utio says, if this is what we say we are, then it is supported by the central budget office. And I would just add that I bet you most of our institutions, their central finance offices are rethinking how they're doing things right now. So this is an opportune moment to step in because they themselves are rethinking how they're doing everything.
Well, let me
And
just
I
add,
want to
go ahead.
I want to add in a very important point, which the entire education industry is struggling with, especially when we are thinking about online or remote learning, that somehow there is this idea from students to faculty to, it's quite pervasive, that it's almost, something less than what an in-person experience can be. And I want to emphasize that it's not a question of less or more, they are different. And, if again, it is over a period of time, these things will settle in. But, for the 18 months when you were working from home, was it less than the work that you did? If you don't feel that, yes, there are, certain advantages to being in person, certain advantages to being able to work remote. We have to think of this in a more holistic manner, that they are different and they accomplish certain different things. And so again, from the revenue perspective, if we think of one as less than the other, we're going to suffer from that kind of, perspective.
Well, if you think, Utio, years ago when we were adding short-term programs of less than 8 weeks, we had the same worry. Then we realized, oh, hang on, we just can't condense a program from 14 weeks into 8 and have the same learning outcomes. Of course we can't. So instead, what we did is what naturally people who do in curriculum development is then we started designing programs for that duration and that level of context. The same thing with online learning. It's not one is less than the other. It's one is differently designed with different goals. And so I think we got to make sure we stay to that. One other quick thing I want to pick up on, I know we're running short on time real fast, and that is about the budget. And specifically what you notice in the report, as Caroline mentioned earlier, 45% of the respondents mentioned changing their funding models or their budget structures. I think there's probably no time like ever that we've seen such dramatic change in how we're funding our offices. But we know some offices are centrally funded or self-funded. Either way, that budget model really makes sense. Now, one of the concerns that I'm seeing is a lot of folks have quickly added variations on other modalities of online learning and engagement, but didn't adjust their funding models. And what I fear is once we will get back to a period where mobility can happen without delay, we will see some offices not having a funding model to support other forms of modalities because they haven't taken the time now to say, hang on, how can we continue our funding or our operational infrastructures in alignment with these other modalities, because they've been entrenched for decades on mobility-based learning. And that's a real worry. We've got to be very careful not to fall into that. Sorry, Chris.
I think Kyle asked a really good question here. I guess I'll kick it to you, Kyle. Kyle Rausch asked a good question. I'll kick it to this Kyle on the panel. The old argument of why should I pay for this online virtual experience if I can find all of this information open source on the internet, even if it's lower cost than a traditional mobility-based study abroad program? Why should I pay for this virtual experience if in concept, in theory, I could find all the information for free on the internet? Any thoughts on how to best respond to that?
Right. That sounds like it's a design problem. Of course, design problem, right? We always ask ourselves, anytime we come up with any new model, and Anthony's led us to think in this direction, we have to always ask ourselves, why the difference? Where's the value added? And I'll just give you a for instance. The way that the reason why International Virtual Exchange, or let's say COIL, is taking root at my institution now is because we've disabused everyone's mind from this as a replacement for study abroad. It is an enhancement of intercultural communication and a direct and almost better way to integrate the curriculum almost at a major specific level into a student's experience. So that's what we need to be doing. We need to identify those specific objectives, right? And they could be on the intercultural competency spectrum. For us here at our institutional context, those sorts of what we call virtual plus or IVE programs we're doubling down on that intercultural communication, putting peers together in a way that's really actually harder to do in a study abroad mobility context. So the faculty experience, they begin to see that, oh, those types of conversations we were having with our international peers, the kinds of projects we were doing together are very rare in a student mobility experience. But we can do them right here in a very surgical way in our curriculum through these these online programs. The experts we have access to, the different students. So I think that is the trick. Anytime that course is available or designed, we have to ask ourselves, what is it we're trying to deliver?
And again, like we spoke about, collaborating with, the chief diversity officer or DEI officers. We have talked about this for decades, and have still struggled to make the shift from that multicultural to intercultural perspective. But those kind of things need to be beyond just what work a global education office does. It needs to be part of the university ethos in how we are training everyone in that aspect. We've been successful. I mean, through HR, we are asking for those kind of competencies, and this is not a test of pass or fail, but it is a test of how can we, help you along that, maybe that IDI spectrum or something like that, so that everyone continues to understand and get that kind of global perspective in place. This is an opportune moment. The pandemic gave us a chance to, get off the cruise control, get off the highway, stop, reflect. Okay, if we cannot take this time or have not used this time to think about it, or even the time coming forward, we have missed an opportunity. Whether you want to use design thinking to help, we need to come into it with a model of empathy, a model of understanding, a model that is tailored to where we are. And I think that would be the way to go forward with this.
One question sort of somewhat related to that. I would love to get both of your reactions to if there are education abroad professionals here that aren't currently, I think I'm using the right phrase here, an academic unit. Is now the time to push for that? If that's something that you desire, is the time right now, or is it not for one reason or another? I'd love to get your perspectives on that.
I think this whole thing, universities think about curriculum. That's where courses lie. That's where revenues getting stuck now, because certain online courses may be in some department and the revenue may not flow back to the education abroad office and things like that. But broadly, we need a 4-dimensional kind of perspective into this, that it is curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular, and how do we blend all of these things together? Again, going back to actually competency development will help guide those learning objectives, and again, tie back to mission, to the work that you're doing, the values that the university and those offices espouse, and then translating them into actual actionable steps.
Well, Utio, you said it correctly right before we began, and that is, gosh, we only have an hour. And here we are, and I have about 12 more questions I want to ask you and the participants today. But let me just finish up with one final question. And as you heard earlier with Alad's comment about that there's a real difference, at least in these respondents, between public institutions and private institutions, as well as larger sending institutions versus smaller. And the findings are pretty significant. Why do you think that? What's happening?
I want to jump in there because one of my first reactions when I read this report, besides just being shocked that everyone thought we were in a new era, which I love, but it was that discrepancy, and I began to think, okay, well, I've been in a lot of webinars and conferences where I've been speaking to my colleagues from all different sized institutions, and I didn't see a lot of that positivity that we see in the report when I was talking with them. And okay, so why might that be the case? It might be a strategic mission issue, right? At smaller institutions, right, with smaller offices and smaller, let's say, inbound and outbound students, that means we can only focus on so many parts of those pillars of comprehensive internationalization. And as we all know, what did that mean in the past for most of us? It meant doubling down on study abroad. And so now that we're faced with another year, right, I can see that at smaller private institutions, particularly those that don't hang their hat on international education, that is a scary place to be. Whereas at large public universities, where you might be more sensitive to, let's say, downsizing in some ways, you can also pivot in a different kind of way with your professionals. So that's my initial reaction to that.
Utio, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've had mixed feedback from both universities public and private. I mean, I am at a private university now, having worked in the past in both, land grant Ivy and other public institutions. I think various places have their own requirements on how they've been funding, but I think people are willing to change some of the ways. They are all at this point thinking bottom line budgets and thinking survival, but we need to think a little long term in that, in how these things will really happen. We also need to emphasize that, as professionals, as employees of the university, are you being valued at the place that you work? I mean, this is also a reflection of that. I mean, are you so dispensable? And that means, I mean, throughout this time, we couldn't make a case for how we complement the university's work. So we need to really, have this conversation at multiple levels. It is not easy. It is very difficult for places and people to change. But we saw that when push came to shove, we had to do it. Now is again the opportunity to settle into a path which is not myopic in its outlook, that we have a longer term outlook into that. We have been very lucky at where we are. In fact, we are hiring, apply, all of those. I mean, we would love this to continue. We would love other universities to be able to embrace this. And I think together as an industry, we have to make the case for it, provide people resources, thoughts, brainstorm, and continue this conversation.
Well, let me say, Ujio and Kyle, thank you so very much for those comments, and well articulated and insightful as always. I think going back to your reference to Industry 4.0, Ujio, I think it's really very interesting to see the changes to higher education generally, and then specifically understanding how institution type really does matter in this case. And it's specifically going to influence the types of decisions and the type of future directions that institutions will take vis-a-vis online learning and engagement. Now, we've run short of time, but I want to just very quickly advance to the next slide. Chris, unless you have something else to add, I'd like to cover a couple of the recommendations.
Please.
Well, folks, I'm sure by now all of you have downloaded and highlighted all different sections of this report. I encourage you to continue to ask questions and continue that vibrant discussion in the chat. I see Kyle Rausch and others are just having lots of lively and friendly debate. And I think that's very important because this is a time of change and this is a time of new questions. Now, for us at Podium Education and Gateway International Group, the report brought a number of insights to us in the form of recommendations that for consideration, really. And then you at your relative institution or organization, you can decide what you'd like to do with them. We don't have enough time to go over these, but I do want to mention just a few in particular. And the first one, of course, is about pushing forward. And that is, we at Gateway and at Podium, we've been talking a great deal about making really accentuating the drive forward. And that is, we have now got this great opportunity to that we've seen the mainstreaming of online and other forms of international learning and engagement happen. Let's not go backwards. And what I mean by that is, as mobility returns and as our institutional structures prevail, there will be a temptation just to get back to the way things are. But let's not forget, the way things were that we were only dealing with very privileged students who were able to participate in studying abroad. And even in that case, it was a small percentage. Now we have a chance to go back to what I said at the outset of this webinar today, and that is the chance that our goal is to graduate all students, not just 14% or whatever percentage it is at your institution. That's very, very important. I also want to jump down the list here to achieving diversity. We have been talking in education abroad world about very seriously about diversity and and non-traditional participation for decades. It's at least going back to, as my memory serves, to the CIE conference in 1991, where we were talking about supporting underrepresented students in education abroad. But if you look at the percentage of particular demographic populations in our education abroad numbers, it hasn't changed in 30 years. It really hasn't changed. Now we have a larger national and international context that says, hey, we need to support access, inclusion, and equity. And so by golly, let's do that. Let's be thinking very seriously at our respective institutions and organizations about how we can contribute to making sure our education abroad participation in education abroad in all of its forms is truly representative to our institutional numbers and demographic enrollment. So let's be serious about this. Let's not miss this opportunity. And then finally, in the interest of time, I just want to talk about one more, and that is reframing expectations. I have been looking at education abroad offices for several months now and seeing how folks are presenting this expanded portfolio. And a lot of education abroad offices are doing something I think is a real problem. And that is they're saying remote or online or virtual learning and traditional learning or real education abroad, or all these types of terminology. And it worries me when we start front-ending these types of framing of our programs to our students, then they're going to come to it with that framing. In other words, some folks have told me lately that, oh, my students are just not interested in online programming. But if you're presenting to your students, ooh, would you like to do a virtual program? Well, they're not going to get excited. What I'm saying is let's not allow framing to get in the way of education. Allow students to think about very clearly what they want to learn and to be able to achieve. And then only secondarily, look at the modality of delivery, the duration of the program, the language of instruction, the destination. Let's not forget that modality should not drive decision. It should be a secondary framing. Just when a faculty member decides, they don't go to a classroom and then decide what they want to teach. Let's not let the modality drive. But that case, let's embrace new and more mainstreaming modalities. Now, in interest of time, and we only have 1 second, I just want to say once again to everybody, thank you so much to my colleagues and friends at Podium Education and my own team at Gateway Education Abroad, and to all of you, especially to those of you who've answered this survey. Thank you so very much for being part of this today, and I hope that we will continue to ask some of the tough questions that Utio and Kyle were very brave to answer today, and I'm very grateful to them, and again grateful to all of you, and especially to Chris Parrish and the good folks over at Podium Education. Chris, anything to take us out?
I was just going to say thank you as well. Thank you to Utio and Kyle for joining us, and Tony for all your leadership on this. If you do have additional follow-up questions, please reach out to us. We want to hear from you. We want to continue to iterate on this report and the takeaways from it. It's going to be complicated here for the next 6 to 9 months, just as it was for the last 18. So let's stick together and share what we learn. And I know the discipline will be better off for it. So thanks again.
And feel free to reach out to myself. I'm sure OTO feels the same way. If you have questions or you want to brainstorm some things, we don't have all the answers, but we got some maybe. So thank you, everybody.
And we will be in touch with a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording, as well as some other information. So stay tuned. Let's keep the conversation going, folks. Everybody have a great afternoon wherever you are in the world. We'll see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks all.